I don't talk about this with people I know. My wife has heard parts of it, enough to understand why I stopped taking the evening walks I used to love, why I sold the property in Winnebago County and never looked back. But I've never told the whole thing from start to finish, not until now. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years working for the county road department in northern Iowa, maintaining drainage ditches, grading gravel roads, managing culvert repairs across about 400 square miles of farmland and river bottomland. I know that country the way some people know their own backyard. Every township road, every creek crossing, every low spot that floods in March. I'm not someone who imagines things. I'm not someone given to exaggeration or to seeing things that aren't there. What I saw standing at the edge of Gerald Thatcher's soybean field on a September evening in 2017 was none of the things I've spent years trying to convince myself it was. Let me tell you about that part of Iowa first, because it matters. People who haven't spent time in the rural north-central part of the state think of Iowa as flat and open, nothing but cornfields you can see across for miles. And in a lot of places, that's accurate enough. But Winnebago County isn't like that everywhere, especially not along the river corridors. Along the Shell Rock River and its tributaries, the land folds into something older and stranger than the picture most people carry in their heads. There are timbered draws that cut down through the fields without warning, deep enough that you can be standing in one and not see the cropland 20 yards above you. Cottonwood and box elder crowd the banks, and wild plum and dogwood fill in the understory so thick that in summer you can't push through without a machete. In places the forest is dark enough that you lose the sky entirely, even in the middle of the afternoon, and the ground stays damp and cold well into June. The Thatcher property sat right at the edge of one of those draws, about 200 acres of row crops butting up against maybe 40 acres of river timber that nobody had touched in decades. Gerald had let it go wild, which was fine by him and fine by the deer and the turkeys that used the timber as a refuge during hunting season. It was fine by me too, when I used to drive that stretch of County Road B14 in the late afternoon and watch the light go golden on the edge of those trees. There was something peaceful about that particular spot, the way the open field and the dark timber met along a crooked line that followed the natural contour of the land. A lot of Iowa has been straightened and squared and drained until the original shape of the land is almost gone. That corner of the Thatcher property still had its original shape. I used to appreciate that. I don't anymore. I drive a different way now, have driven a different way for 7 years, and I expect I will keep driving that different way for whatever time I have left. The evening it happened was the second week of September. I'd finished a drainage inspection on a county tile line about 3 miles north and was heading back to the equipment yard in Forest City. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesday afternoons I usually stopped at the Casey's on the south end of town for a cup of coffee before turning in my paperwork, and I remember that I did not stop that evening. I drove straight to the yard, straight home after that, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying anything to my wife, which was unusual enough that she asked me twice if I was feeling all right. The sun was maybe 40 minutes from setting when I turned onto B14. Still enough light to see clearly, that particular quality of late-day September light that makes everything look sharp and a little too present, like the world is leaning toward you. The fields on either side of the road had been mostly cut by then, the beans already off and the ground dark and clean, the stubble catching the low light at an angle that made it look almost silver. I had the window down. The air smelled like cut beans and river mud and the faint sweetness of something I couldn't quite name, something I had been smelling along that river corridor for years without ever giving it much thought. I know now that I should have paid closer attention to that smell. I know now that it wasn't the river. I was driving slow, under 30, the way I always did on that particular stretch because the curves near the timber were unpredictable, and deer would step out onto the road without warning in that last hour before full dark. I had hit 2 deer in my years driving county roads, and I had no interest in hitting a third. I came around the long sweeping bend where B14 straightens out and runs parallel to the east field of the Thatcher property, maybe 50 yards of open ground between the road shoulder and the place where the bean field ended and the timber began. The light was hitting that field margin directly, clean and clear with no shadows falling across it yet, and that is the only reason I saw what I saw as clearly as I did. If it had been 30 minutes later, or if the field had been in corn instead of beans, I might have driven past without seeing anything at all. I'm not sure anymore whether that would have been a mercy. At first I thought it was a person. My mind went there immediately and without hesitation, because the shape was upright and two-legged, and it was standing out in the open at the very edge of the field, where the last row of soybean stubble met the first line of trees. It was facing mostly away from me and slightly angled, looking out across the open field toward the west in the setting sun, the way a man might stand at the edge of his property just taking in the evening. I eased off the gas without really deciding to, the way you do when something registers as out of place before you've figured out what it is. My foot found the brake, and I slowed to nearly a stop about 120 feet away, maybe a little less. I thought for a moment it might be Gerald Thatcher himself, or one of his sons checking the field margin for storm damage, though it was late for that kind of work, and there were no vehicles parked anywhere along the road or the field approach that I could see. Then I noticed the height, and the noticing of it happened the way those things sometimes happen, slowly at first and then all at once. Whatever was standing at that field margin was too tall. Not dramatically so in isolation, not in a way that would necessarily register in a photograph or at a quick glance from a moving vehicle, but in the way that your brain processes a familiar silhouette, and something in the fundamental geometry of it simply does not resolve. The shoulders were too high off the ground. The torso was too long relative to the legs. The legs themselves were too long relative to everything else. And the head, even seen from behind and at that slight angle, sat on the neck in a way that was not right, that did not match the tens of thousands of times I had seen a human head sit on a human neck. I sat there with the truck idling in the middle of that empty county road, and I stared, and my mind did what minds do when they are presented with something they do not have a category for. It cycled through possibilities. Tall man in dark clothing, somebody in a heavy hunting jacket that was distorting the shoulder line, a scarecrow, though I had never seen Gerald use scarecrows, and the thing was standing on two legs with its weight distributed the way living things distribute weight, subtly shifting and present rather than fixed and rigid. A shadow thrown at a strange angle by the low western sun. But the sun was behind me at that point, coming over my left shoulder as I faced south, and the light on that field margin was clean and even, and the thing standing there was casting its own shadow out ahead of it, a long shadow pointing northwest across the bean stubble, and that shadow had a shape that I cannot describe as human, no matter how many times I have tried to describe it that way in the years since. It turned its head, not its body, just its head, rotating slowly to one side in a single smooth, deliberate motion, the way an animal scans its surroundings when it has detected something without being startled by it. A wolf does this. A coyote does this. You see it on wildlife footage, and it registers as a specific kind of movement, controlled and economical and almost mechanical in its precision, nothing wasted in it. This was that movement, but scaled up, performed by a head that was far too large and sat too high off the ground. I could see the profile against the darker edge of the timber behind it, the outline of it in that clear September light, and what I saw in that outline made something in my chest go quiet and cold in a way I had never felt before, and have never stopped feeling since. The head was not a human head. The snout extended outward from the face much too far. The ears sat high on the skull and came to a distinct point. The overall shape of it was canine in a way that was not ambiguous, not a matter of angle or light or imagination. I had the distinct and terrible sense, sitting there in that idling truck, that it already knew I was there. That the slow movement of the head was not the discovery of my presence, but the acknowledgement of it. That it had known I was on that road before I had seen it, possibly before I had even turned onto B14, and that the turn of the head was something closer to a greeting than a reaction. The smell reached me then, coming through the open window all at once, and I cannot fully account for why it hit me as hard as it did, or why it hit me at that specific moment rather than earlier. Something between wet animal and something underneath that was older and heavier and wrong in a way that bypassed description and went directly to the body. I had smelled deer carcasses in various stages of decomposition. I had smelled the musk of coyotes on a hot day. I had smelled dead livestock in August. None of those smells had ever made me want to roll up my window and lock my doors, but this one did, and I did both of those things before I had consciously decided to do either of them. The creature still had not turned fully toward me. It remained mostly in profile at that field margin, that long head angled in my direction, and it was absolutely still in a way that large animals almost never sustain. No shifting of weight, no movement of the ears, no visible breathing. Just standing there at the line between the open field and the dark timber, as motionless as something that has decided to be motionless, and the stillness of it was worse. In some way I still cannot explain than motion would have been. Motion would have been a reaction. This was something else. This was patience. I looked at the arms. I'd been avoiding looking at the arms, but I looked at them then, hanging at the creature's sides, and they were too long. The hands, or whatever they were at the end of those arms, reached down past where the knees would be on a man of that height. I registered that detail, and something in my chest locked up hard, and the first real wave of fear moved through me from the feet upward, the kind of fear that has no thought in it, that belongs to a part of the brain that has been doing its job for a very long time and does not need your permission to operate. I put the truck in gear. I did it slowly and deliberately, without allowing myself to hurry, because some part of me understood without being able to explain it that I did not want to make any sudden movement, did not want to do anything that might change whatever the creature was currently doing in relation to me. I eased forward, staying well under 20 miles an hour, watching the thing in my side mirror as the truck rolled past the field margin. It did not move. It did not turn to follow me with its body. It only stood there with that long head held at its angle, watching me go with a patience that felt, and I know how this sounds, deliberate, chosen, as though it had decided to let me leave, and wanted me to understand that the decision had been its to make. I watched it in the mirror until the road curved, and the tree line took it from my sight. Then I drove the remaining miles to Forest City without stopping, without turning on the radio, without doing anything except keeping both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road ahead of me. I sat in the parking lot of the equipment yard for a long time after I arrived. I did not go inside until I was reasonably certain that my hands had stopped shaking. I did not report what I had seen. I want to be clear about that, and about why, because I think the why matters more than people usually acknowledge when they ask why witnesses stay quiet. It was not entirely about fear of ridicule, though that was part of it. It was not entirely about professional reputation, though that was part of it too. It was mostly about the fact that I did not have a language for what I had seen that would survive contact with another person's reasonable skepticism. I had seen a large figure standing at a field margin at dusk. I had seen it for less than 2 minutes from a moving vehicle. Whatever I believed privately about what that figure was, the version of the story that could be told out loud to a sheriff's deputy or a DNR officer or my supervisor at the county road department was a version that would end with someone nodding slowly and suggesting I might be tired, might need to cut back on my hours, might want to talk to somebody. I was not willing to be that man, so I said nothing. What I did instead was go back. I am not proud of that decision, and I cannot fully explain it even now. I think there is something in the way certain experiences lodge themselves in the mind that makes the ordinary responses, avoidance, denial, forward motion, feel insufficient. I needed to know whether there was something at that field margin that had a reasonable explanation, because the alternative was to carry what I had seen without any framework to put it in, and I was not ready to do that. I told myself I was going to look for tracks. I told myself I was a practical man doing a practical thing. I went back on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the sighting, in full daylight, well before noon. I parked on the road shoulder at the bend and walked the field margin from the road to the timber edge. The ground was soft enough from a rain we'd had the previous weekend that impressions held well, and I found them without much difficulty. They were in the soft dirt at the very edge of the field, where the bean stubble gave way to the first strip of heavy grass before the timber began. Large prints, canine in their basic structure, with the distinct claw marks ahead of each toe pad that you see in dog and wolf tracks. But the size was wrong for any canine I knew of in that part of Iowa, and the stride length was wrong. And most significantly, the depth and spacing of the prints told a story about an animal moving on 2 legs rather than 4. I've seen enough deer tracks and coyote tracks and raccoon tracks and the occasional wolf track in my years working that county to know what bipedal locomotion looks like in soft ground versus quadrupedal. The weight distribution is different. The way the soil compresses under the ball of the foot versus the heel tells you something about how the body above it is oriented. These prints were made by something walking upright. I measured the clearest one with a tape measure I had brought from the truck, 14 inches from the back of the heel pad to the front of the longest toe. I stood there in that quiet Thursday morning with the tape measure in my hands, and I looked at that number for a long time. Then I took 3 photographs with my phone, filled in the prints carefully with my boot so that they were no longer legible, and walked back to my truck. I've asked myself many times since then why I filled them in. The honest answer is that I did not want anyone else to find them. I did not want the thing that had made them to become a public event, a news story, a reason for people to come out to that road with their cameras and their theories. I cannot fully explain that impulse, except to say that it felt, and still feels, like the right thing to have done. The photographs are still on my phone. I have shown them to 2 people in 7 years, my wife and a man I met at a farm equipment show in Mason City, who told me quietly, after I had listened to him describe something he had encountered near the Iowa-Minnesota border in 2014, that he believed me without needing to see them. I appreciated that more than I can say. I want to tell you about the second time, because there was a second time, and it was worse. Not because what I saw was more dramatic, but because of what it told me about the first encounter that I had been working hard not to think about. It was 6 weeks after the field sighting, late October, the kind of Iowa October evening that comes on fast and cold with a wind off the northwest that strips the last leaves and makes the timber sound like it is breathing. I was driving the same road, not because I had stopped avoiding it, but because a culvert washout 3 miles east had forced a detour that brought me back through that stretch for the first time since I had stopped using it deliberately. It was close to 5 in the afternoon, and already getting dark fast, the sky in the west going from orange to deep purple while I watched it, and I had my headlights on. I was past the Thatcher field margin before I saw anything. Half a mile past it, maybe a little more, where B14 dips down into a low crossing over a tributary creek, and the timber closes in tight on both sides of the road. I had my window up against the cold and the radio on low, some talk program I was not really listening to. I slowed for the crossing the way I always did because the approach was steep enough to bottom out a truck if you came in too fast. That is the only reason I was going slowly enough to see what I saw in the tree line to my left. It was standing in the timber, maybe 30 feet back from the road, in a gap between 2 large cottonwoods, where a little of the last western light came through at a low angle. It was facing me directly this time, not in profile, not looking away across a field, but facing the road with its full attention, and even at 30 feet in the near dark of that closing October evening, I could see the eyes. They caught the light from my headlights and held it, reflecting it back in a way that was amber and flat and utterly still. And there was something in the steadiness of that reflected light, no blinking, no shift or movement of any kind, that communicated a quality of attention I had no word for and still do not. I crossed the culvert without stopping. I accelerated up the far bank, and I did not look in my mirrors, and I did not slow down again until I had put 2 full miles between myself and that creek crossing. My heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my fingertips on the steering wheel. The radio was still playing, and I remember reaching over and turning it off because the sound of it felt wrong, felt like it was covering something I needed to be able to hear, though I was well past any distance where hearing would have mattered. What the second sighting told me was something I had been refusing to consider since the first one. It told me that the creature's presence at the Thatcher field margin 6 weeks earlier had not been coincidental to my being there. The field margin was nearly a mile from that creek crossing, and the territory between them was continuous timber, following the river draw, dense and undisturbed and connected all the way through. Whatever it was, it used that timber the way I used county roads. It moved through it regularly. It knew that stretch of B14 the way any territorial animal knows the boundaries of its range. And in all likelihood, it had been along that road, through that timber, past those fields, many times in the years I'd been driving that route without my knowing it. That thought, once it arrived, was not one I could set aside. I had been driving that road for years, sometimes in the dark, sometimes alone, sometimes with the window down in summer. I had parked along that road margin more than once to eat my lunch and watch the deer move at the timber edge. I had walked the ditch lines through that section on foot during drainage inspections, alone, without anything more than a cell phone that got no signal in the low ground near the river. The thing I had seen standing at that field margin, patient and still and already aware of me before I was aware of it, had in all probability been in that timber many times while I was working nearby. I had simply never seen it. It had simply never allowed itself to be seen. I requested a reassignment the following week. I told my supervisor I needed a change of territory for personal reasons, and he didn't push me on it, which I was grateful for. I started covering roads on the east side of the county, and I did not go back to B14. We sold the property near Winnebago County the following spring, which my wife understood better than she let on, I think, even without knowing everything. We moved 30 miles east to a part of the county that sits on higher ground, away from the river draws, away from that particular kind of timber. I sleep better there, not well, but better. I've thought a great deal in the years since about what it means to have driven that road as many times as I drove it, to have worked that country as long as I worked it, and to have been as wrong as I was about what shared it with me. I had believed, the way most people believe without ever examining the belief, that I knew what was out there, that the inventory of things living in those fields and timber draws was complete and familiar. Deer, coyotes, turkeys, the occasional fox, things with names and shapes I recognized. That belief felt like knowledge. It felt like the product of 32 years of working the land and paying attention. I know now that it was not knowledge, it was assumption. It was the comfort of a framework that had never been seriously tested, and when it was tested, it failed completely. And the thing standing at the edge of that field in the September light was the proof of that failure. I don't have an explanation for what I saw. I am not going to offer one. I've read enough and thought enough in the years since to know that the people who have explanations for things like this are usually the people who weren't there, and the people who were there mostly stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. I stopped trying somewhere around the end of that first year. What I have now is not explanation, but accommodation. A way of carrying the knowledge that the world contains things I do not have names for, and that some of those things are large and patient and aware of us in ways we are not aware of them. If you spend time in the rural Midwest, in the timbered draws along the river corridors, in the places where the farmland ends and the old growth begins, I am not going to tell you to be afraid. Fear without direction is useless. What I will tell you is this: pay attention to the smell. Pay attention when the birds go quiet. And if you are driving a back road at dusk and you see a shape at a field margin that your mind immediately wants to explain away, trust the part of you that noticed before the explaining started. That part is older than the rest. In my experience, it is also more accurate.